So, it's only January, but it already seems safe to say we're having quite a year. I mean, for one thing, the invasion of Ukraine is still ongoing, which of course is on its own very much a sort of maybe the seismic diplomatic changing event of our lifetime. It's certainly very significant. That's still ongoing and developing. There's been the unilateral, effectively, capture of a head of state by the USA in the capture of President Maduro of Venezuela and removing him from power, like a unilateral decision taken by the USA. And if that wasn't enough, you've also got open talk and speculation about the possibility of the USA, very much the sort of the pivotal, the load-bearing pillar of the NATO, potentially taking territory from another NATO member. Speculation openly about the possibility of not by consent but by force even, and just seizing that bit territory, which if it were to happen, you can't imagine how that wouldn't mean the end of NATO as we know it, if not altogether. Now, I mention all this because Japan, in a strict legal sense, has no military. It cannot have a military, and it doesn't have a nuclear deterrent. And so all of this, in appearance, if not necessarily in reality, seems to suggest that sort of the post-World War II system of international cooperation, a move away from just state sovereignty and towards a sort of global cooperation, international law, international bodies, security assurances, sort of working together through sort of a rules-based order. That seems to be coming more or less to a downturn, to an end, if not an end. These are the systems upon which Japan very much relies for its very existence and survival, given, as I say, it doesn't have a nuclear deterrent, it doesn't have a military of its own legally. It relies on the security arrangement, and it looks like a return to sort of the bad old, pre-World War II days of, alliance blocks, realpolitik, countries doing what they can because they have the might to do so, because it represents their interests, and simply acting to your own advantage and national sovereignty versus, thinking about what legally in international law can you do. It's simply acting because it's to your advantage. It's a shift back to those days. At least that's what these events already in January seem to be suggesting, a shift. And we'll have to see what happens with that and with Greenland. So we certainly, at the very least, live in a sort of a very chaotic moment, and it'll be interesting to see diplomatically, politically, what this global chaos, what direction it's headed in, and what this will mean for Japan. To take those on the road a little bit, Ukraine is just such a pivotal sort of key example of a country that had sort of tangible security, at least in theory, in terms of nuclear weapons, something which Japan, for obvious reasons, has eschewed, and I'll get to that later. Whether it was a real choice or not, in the end they made a decision to give up the sort of the tangible security Ukraine of nuclear weapons in return for all sorts of security guarantees, and obviously that didn't lead to their long-term protection, because those assurances didn't stop the war in Ukraine, which is, as I say, still ongoing in 2026. Then as I say, the USA, which is Japan's key security ally, they have made the unilateral decision to sort of seize Maduro and change the head of state of Venezuela. And now Greenland, which is really, if that were to happen, it is possibly the most shocking thing of all. This might not happen in reality. It might just be sort of classic art of the deal from Trump, where he makes the sort of audacious suggestion, or that there's noise that he could do this audacious thing of seizing Greenland, but what he's really pushing for is possibly purchasing it, although there seems to be some resistance, to say the least, from Denmark at that idea. And so, as I say, this sort of suggests that the status quo upon which Japan is very much reliant and used to is sort of a bit, seems in question at the moment. And so I want to look today at sort of how it's responding to this sort of chaos and what it means for Japan in the medium and long term. Because I think this could have like big consequences for Japan beyond just, the obvious of what this means for the threat of China and Taiwan, which is still something that I think is very much key for the Japanese political scene at the moment. Japan has its own diplomatic issue at the moment, of course, because we talked previously about how Sanae Takaichi, the new Prime Minister of Japan, made these comments about Taiwan, and how if China were to take military direct action, that might be an existential threat for Japan. Now, since I last spoke about it, these tensions really haven't been resolved, and in fact China have sort of moved on to the next escalation, you could say, of potentially of cutting off the supply of rare earths to Japan. Now, these rare earths are obviously pivotal for Japan's industry in general, and in particular their pivot in towards AI, which Sanae Takaichi's talked about, and possibly wanting to build up in Hokkaido their own sort of independent silicon chip production, sort of away from Taiwan, given the security issues of that, and also wanting to build that up as like a sort of their own independent industry to sort of build up Hokkaido and make that as a sort of adjacent AI industry within Japan to sort of support AI economy growth. So that by this potential end of supply of rare earths to Japan, that very much threatens all of that and their economy, as well as their ability to pivot into that that growth area. It's interesting to think if the Greenland takeover by the USA, which I talked about earlier, if that actually were to happen, it's interesting to think if that might actually possibly even be a long-term resolution for this issue if Japan were to secure a supply of rare earths from Greenland, which apparently is meant to be quite rich in them, if it were to come under USA control, given that the USA is very much the key Japanese ally. Now, of course, that would take, to say the least, a bit of a challenge to actually for this acquisition of Greenland to happen and to get this rare earth production up. As I understand, that's very logistically difficult. It's just sort of an interesting thing to tie those two things together. So at the moment, it would appear that not only does Japan have this sort of this difficulty of not wanting to lose face and back down to China, and the knock-on consequences now of the rare earths sort of block that China's threatening on them, and the tourism, which they've also effectively tried to cut off to Japan as well, and the economic challenges in a time where Japan's already suffering sort of cost of living issues, things like the rice crisis, inflation, and on top of that, they also have this element of not only dealing with China, but sort of the very system of sort of global, cooperation that they've grown used to and they rely on for their security. That it seems increasingly uncertain at the moment. So there's sort of a lot there for Japan to worry about beyond the China issue alone. I mean, the fact that there's open discussion of the possibility of China taking action against Taiwan and Japan sort of being dragged into that is in of itself an incredible, rare era-defining issue, and then to have all these other like sort of global chaotic elements as well it's quite a key moment for Japan. So that given that this China tension's continuing, and then you have also this sort of global chaos, I want to look at one, what is Japan's response to this, and two, this nuclear issue, which I've alluded to already a bit, which incredibly has come back in the news for Japan. Well, one response that Sanae Takaichi is already taking is, despite the fact that it appears it's going to lead to an increased debt, which is already an issue in Japan, it looks like Sanae Takaichi is sort of pushing towards increasing military spending. I believe she had a target of something like 2% GDP being the target for Japan's military, and sort of wanting to get the amount of spending of Japan's total economy going towards the military to go up. And so there's very much a big push at the moment for Sanae Takaichi to do that, as she appears to be intent on pushing more money into sort of building up Japan's military, which is kind of incredible in of itself, given that legally Japan cannot have a military, although of course in practice it really does. But that seems to be one element of response to the sort of chaos, is that Sanae Takaichi is pushing more money towards the military, which sort of makes me think that, combined with all this uncertainty and the fact that she appears evidently willing to spend more on the military, Sanae Takaichi, and the fact that she's sort of the Abe faction, very much, has in the past been seen as the successor to Shinzo Abe, given that Abe so very much wanted to have the referendum on Japan's constitution and making the military officially legal and allowed in Japan again, and he had plans to do that but never got around to holding the referendum. I wonder if that could be something that Sanae Takaichi could pursue along with this growth in military spending. There's already murmurs that Sanae Takaichi could push to an early election. She opted not to do that in her initial honeymoon phase, where she took over the government despite having a surge of popularity and appearing to do very well in the polls. but that popularity seems to generally be holding. There's all this global chaos, as I say. She's pushing for more military spending. I'm wondering if, given the difficulties with her coalition, now I don't think it's particularly that Ishin are incredibly unhappy, but I think they've had difficulty in getting all the things they wanted and demands they had for going into coalition with the LDP, getting them through. They haven't been pushing the requirement they initially had to sort of end campaign contributions from companies to Japanese political parties. That's something they wanted, but that's sort of not been on the scene as much. Then they were going to want to reduce the overall size of the diet. That was going to then, it appears, be their top priority. But given the possible strength of opposition to that, that also has been quietly shelved. And Ishin, at one point, I believe, were hinting that they might leave the coalition if that wasn't granted to them. So they've basically not got those key demands at the moment, and they also haven't joined the cabinet. So there's sort of, and also, as I say, they've sort of hinted at points publicly about the idea that if they didn't get what they want, they would lead the coalition. So that sort of all lends to the idea that Ishin aren't particularly doing very well out of this coalition so far. They haven't got anything tangible out of it. And they even made a speech when they joined government with the LDP saying, oh, this is something we're doing. To paraphrase their leader, he said, this is an act of sort of, self-sacrifice. We're doing sort of the noble grown-up thing by joining the coalition because otherwise there's not going to be a government. Which might be fair enough and accurate, but it doesn't sound like someone who's, sort of very keen and overjoyed to jump into a coalition and jump into government. So all of that, along with, as I say, Sanae Takaichi's popularity, has led to some noise about the possibility she might call an early election, which maybe leads to her possibly, you could see the appeal that she might include the possibility of having a referendum on making the constitution legal, or talking about it in her campaign, and say, look, we've got all this global chaos, we need to respond to it. So I wonder if in response to this global chaos is one thing she could do, as well as growing her military, is look to reform the military and make it, possibly constitutionally legal, which would allow and make military action in future a bit easier. And if she were to get elected, and regain the LDP's majority, given this at something of a historic low ebb, she would very much appear to have a mandate to do that. So we'll have to watch that space and see if she goes for an early election this year or not. But it's interesting to think about. Another response from the Japanese government and Sanae Takaichi appears to be that she's effectively doubling down on Trump. Now there seems to be a little bit of a divide, you could argue. At least that's my personal opinion, because in Europe, for obvious reasons, given that there's noise about the possibility of effectively taking Greenland from Denmark, many European leaders have had to make stances on this. I believe Starmer said he wouldn't join in and cooperate with the US if they were to do that. And so maybe Europe is a little bit more directly concerned, given it's happening sort of effectively on their turf, and it would unwind sort of NATO in possibility if this were to happen. In contrast, I believe Sanae Takaichi's made statements saying she wants to have even closer ties and closer alliances with the USA, which I think makes sense because it's so unbelievably important to have the USA as a key security ally for Japan. I mean, their military is very important. They've got a number of bases there. And given that Japan doesn't have its own independent nuclear deterrent, and legally it's not even allowed a military, I mean, it's just so important having that key relationship with the USA, and so it makes sense to sort of double down and secure that. Aside from the fact that Sanae Takaichi is sort of, you could argue, a natural ally to Trump more than her predecessor Ishiba was, arguably. They appear to have a good personal relationship, so it makes sense for her to double down and say, oh, we want to continue having good ties with the USA at the moment. It makes sense to come out and say that. Also, you could, this is maybe me reading too much into it, but if we are shifting away from sort of more global cooperation, or at least it appears that way at the moment, and more towards sort of personal, like country-to-country relationships and the old system of alliance blocks, well, surely, given how intertwined the USA and Japan are already, it makes sense to fall in with the USA and make sure you have, a personal alliance with them outside of, just generally being a member of sort of global security assurances and international bodies, and having assurances that generally the international community will help Japan if they're attacked. It makes sense if we're reverting to sort of realpolitik and alliance blocks, if that is the reality, to have a personal relationship and a personal alliance with the USA in particular, rather than sort of just being part of a global network. So maybe that makes sense that Sanae Takaichi is doubling down on having a close relationship with the USA as a result of this. Now, in very interesting timing, also, there's been a bit of a story when it comes to nuclear, the nuclear issue in Japan. Now, a Japanese official has come out, he's been caught saying effectively that Japan needs a nuclear deterrent, or words to that effect. Now, for obvious reasons, this is incredibly shocking and politically sensitive. I suppose you could say it's maybe sort of the third rail of Japanese politics. For obvious reasons, I mean, the unique history of Japan and World War II, and after World War II having a pacifist constitution, which would make maintaining something like a nuclear weapon, which can only be used as a devastating attack on another country. It's hard to argue it's a defensive weapon, which is sort of the loophole they've used to try and argue that having an army and a navy is okay. It's hard to argue that a nuclear weapon is a defensive proposition. Also, obviously, the sort of the devastating atomic attack on Japan, which ended World War II, obviously makes this an incredibly politically sensitive issue. Nuclear in general, aside from a nuclear weapon, is also, of course, politically sensitive in Japan, given that, the Fukushima disaster, which led to a lot of nuclear plants closing in Japan and to them having to look to alternatives. And it, has really sort of coloured even more the strong opinion of nuclear of many people in Japan, and that sort of was a big influencer for many people politically in Japan, that Fukushima nuke meltdown. I mean, to give one example, the current leader of Reiwa, I believe, entered politics because he was sort of so shaken up by that and so concerned about the dangers of nuclear. That was a sort of his moment for entering politics. So you can imagine there are other people who have that opinion as well, sort of post-Fukushima. It's also interesting that this, just coincidentally, that this sort of story about a bureaucrat, a Japanese official coming out and saying that happened around this moment when it's such a, incredibly chaotic moment politically, globally and diplomatically. And so, as you can imagine, given the incredibly politically sensitive nature of that, this official's comments were sort of met with a lot of condemnation. Many people came out against it, including Shigeru Ishiba, which is, I believe, not the first time he's come out and made a public statement, sort of post his prime ministership, sort of making a strong stand. But he's come out against it. I believe Shigeru Ishiba, the previous prime minister of Japan before Sanae Takaichi, and I'm not aware of any, if it's at all within the thinking of the Japanese government that this is something that any of them believe. It's just so happened that he came out and said this at this moment. If that were the case, if anyone in Japan's government were thinking about it, this is truly terrible for anyone who happens to share that opinion, because it's completely raised a lot of controversy and condemnation. They would have hoped to, if anyone in the Japanese government, and I'm not suggesting they do, wanted to approach the nuclear subject, they would have hoped to do it in a much more careful, sensitive way, as I say, given the unique relationship and history Japan has with this topic, that then, to leak it in this way. However, to play devil's advocate, and I'm not necessarily persuaded of this opinion myself, there is maybe a point to what this official said, that maybe, given the example I mentioned earlier of Ukraine and how they gave up nuclear weapons for sort of international assurances, which in the end didn't protect them, and they're still being invaded despite, the international community coming out and condemning the invasion of Ukraine. You could maybe make an argument that post that, sort of the idea of giving up nuclear weapons has been much weakened, and perhaps it's maybe the only, you could argue, really tangible guarantee of preventing a mass invasion of your country is to have that ultimate deterrent. And given the breakdown of what was conventional wisdom just a few years ago, I mean, it would have been so truly shocking just 5-10 years ago, like open talk about the possibility of one NATO member invading another. It's not something I think that's ever been really contemplated much. But now that's openly being, there's open noise about that. It does sort of make the argument that maybe there's something to be said for having the ultimate defense, the ultimate assurance, given the breakdown of the old, the appearance of the breakdown of sort of these old assurances, this old global order of mutual assurance, cooperation, as opposed to realpolitik and hard power as opposed to soft power. and the spectre of, China, Taiwan, other possible global threats for Japan, it does the current political moment, to play devil's advocate, make it something of an argument for that bureaucrat, although anyone holding that opinion would have wished perhaps that he hadn't made it, given it's so politically sensitive and you'd have to be so careful about this. I'm not necessarily persuaded by that. I mean, it could be that this is things just appear very chaotic at the moment. It's not necessarily guaranteeing that the system Japan relies on at the moment is breaking down or anything like that, or, these things can fluctuate very quickly in politics, and things could calm down, and Japan has survived in this system for a long time. So I don't think it's necessarily true at all that Japan needs a nuclear weapon for its defence, but it's a question that perhaps it's fair to say is going to be raised more if things continue like this. And another thing that's been in the news is there's been a sort of talk about meetings with South Korea, with China, and with Japan. And so I think the leader of South Korea has been quite diplomatic about this, as far as I can tell anyway. That's just my personal opinion. But it's interesting to think what role he could play in sort of the tensions at the moment between China and Japan. Are both sides approaching him, as I say, in a sort of a realpolitik way of building alliances, where sort of South Korea is, of course, literally between China and Japan? Are they both hoping to get him more on their side for that reason, to secure South Korea as sort of a personal ally? Or could it be that maybe there's hope that perhaps South Korea could maybe be a bridge to maybe the two leaders at some point transitioning away from these current tensions and sitting down and coming up with a faith-saving way of ending these tensions? It's interesting to think where these tensions between China and Japan will go, and if this sort of talk of blocking off Japan's rare earths, how long that can be sustained, and if that's just the last step in escalation, or if this is something that will continue. However, as I alluded to earlier when I talked about the possibility that Sanae Takaichi might want to call an early election, despite all these problems, despite all these difficulties she's facing, both domestically and at home, it appears she's still broadly very popular, and this sort of fantastic honeymoon period for her being very strong in the polls, it seems to be more than a honeymoon period. It seems to be, or at the very least it's an extended one. If so, it seems to be fairly solidified. And as I say, she has this sort of very strong support. In particular, I believe she has very strong support among the young, which is perhaps surprising, because LDP, traditionally a Conservative party, sort of younger voters is an area where that's not necessarily been their strength in the past. But I believe, to give one example, I believe one survey put her support among the 18 to 29 demographic at something like 92%. I believe 92.4% just in one poll, which is incredible. And if that's a sustained level of support, I mean, it would be phenomenal for her. And I believe she continues to poll in the general sense quite well. I mean, for example, a recent NHK poll, which just came out, I believe put her around 62% approval, with disapprovals at 21%. And I've seen, as I've mentioned, there was one incredible poll that put her in the 80s at one point. I've seen some in the 70s and generally 60s as well. So that's certainly nothing to be sneezed at, 62% approval. And this sort of adds, as I say, to noise that she may call an early election. And so it appears that despite, as I say, some difficult problems that Sanae Takaichi and Japan in general are facing, her personal approval is quite solid. And I do wonder if there's an element, and this is purely my speculation, of maybe initially she had good honeymoon support, but I wonder if maybe there's an element of, given all these sort of global issues, concerns about tension with China, and global tensions, I wonder if there's an element of her appearance as sort of being a strong leader, sort of her, of course, being more of a right-leaning conservative than Shigeru Ishiba, and her sort of appearance as someone who maybe styles herself as a little bit like Margaret Thatcher, sort of an Iron Lady. Maybe that adds to her support given sort of global tensions at the moment. But that's purely my speculation. Not necessarily why she has such strong support, but it's interesting to think about. In any case, hopefully that gives you a sort of a snapshot impression of what's going on with Japan and how it sort of broadly fits into all sort of the global tension, chaos and uncertainty at the moment, and its possible responses and where things could go from here. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, everyone. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. Sayonara, goodbye.